For over 4 decades, he was the nightmare that haunted California. A man with no face, no name, just a string of unspeakable crimes stretching across cities and lives. He was a burglar, a rapist, a murderer, and for years he vanished like smoke, leaving behind shattered families and unanswered questions. But what if the truth was even darker than we thought? What if the very DNA that finally caught him wasn't what it seemed? This is the story of fear, obsession, and the long road to justice. The story of the man known only as the Golden State Killer, and the conspiracy some believe was hiding in plain sight. The town of Visalia, California, was quiet in the early 1970s. Nestled in the Central Valley, it was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved from driveways, and where trouble was something that happened somewhere else. But something had shifted, subtly. At first, it began with small things. A window left open that should have been closed, a muddy footprint on the carpet, drawers left slightly ajar. Some residents assumed they'd been forgetful. Others felt the unease in their bones, but couldn't quite name it. There were whispers of burglaries, nothing major, but enough to make people start checking their locks twice. The police had no answers, just patterns. The break-ins were strange, messy, but deliberate. Valuables were often untouched. Instead, it was personal items, women's underwear, single earrings, photographs that vanished. Sometimes things were taken, sometimes simply rearranged, disturbed. Whoever was doing this wasn't just stealing. He was watching, studying. By the time the Visalia Police Department realized they had a serial prowler on their hands, he had already hit over 100 homes. He would enter while families were asleep. Sometimes he'd unlock windows days in advance. Sometimes he'd return a second or third time, just to show he could. Residents began calling him the Visalia Ransacker. They didn't know his name. They didn't know what he looked like, but they knew one thing. He was getting braver. And then everything changed. It was the early morning of September 11th, 1975. Claude Snelling, a respected journalism professor at College of the Sequoias, was asleep in his home on Whitney Lane. His daughter was just 16. At around 2 in the morning, Claude heard a noise outside, a soft creak, then something like footsteps. He stepped out onto the carport. There in the darkness was a man. A mask covered his face. He was holding Claude's daughter by the arm, dragging her away from the house. Claude didn't hesitate. He charged. A single gunshot rang out. The bullet hit Claude in the chest. The masked man let go of the girl and ran. Claude collapsed in front of his own home, bleeding, struggling to breathe. By the time paramedics arrived, he was already gone. The murder of Claude Snelling stunned Visalia. For the first time, the threat was real and deadly. The ransacker was no longer just a burglar. He had taken a life, and just like that, he vanished. No more break-ins, no more prowling, no more twisted calling cards. But the silence wouldn't last, because just 40 miles north in Sacramento, another town would soon begin to experience the same unease. Unlocked windows, open drawers, a figure glimpsed at the edge of a yard. The ransacker hadn't stopped. He had simply changed locations, and his next identity would be even more terrifying. Sacramento, California. The city was growing fast, fresh homes rising from old farmland, new families pouring into the suburbs, chasing the promise of safe streets and good schools. The American dream was alive and well in the cul-de-sacs and ranch-style homes of Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and Rancho Cordova. But something followed them here, something that didn't belong in the sunlight. It began with whispers again, reports of prowlers peering through windows, sliding glass doors found unlocked in the morning, dogs barking at shadows that vanished before anyone could see. At first the police dismissed it, pranksters, peeping toms, nervous imaginations in a changing world. But the pattern was familiar, too familiar. And then the attacks began. On the night of June 18, 1976, a woman in Rancho Cordova woke up to a nightmare. She wasn't alone. A man was in her bedroom. He wore a ski mask. He carried a knife. He had been watching her for days. He tied her up. He raped her. He vanished before dawn, leaving nothing behind but terror and rope burns. The newspapers didn't have a name for him yet, but within weeks, there were more victims. Women attacked in their homes, often near bike paths, canals. Always the same MO. The intruder entered quietly, often through unlocked doors or sliding glass windows. He wore a mask. He tied his victims with shoelaces or rope, sometimes their own clothing. He whispered threats, often calling them by name. He moved things around the house, took trophies, and sometimes stayed long after the attack, just watching. He was calm, controlled, and he knew exactly what he was doing. By early 1977, the city had a name for him, the East Area Rapist. Sacramento descended into fear. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Families bought dogs, guns, floodlights. Men began sleeping in shifts, taking turns watching over their wives and daughters. But the East Area Rapist was always one step ahead. He would watch his victims for days beforehand. He'd call them at work, hang up. He'd leave strange messages, heavy breathing, or a chilling whisper. "I'm watching you." In one case, he broke into a home while the husband was there. He tied him up, stacked dishes on the man's back. "If I hear those plates rattle," he whispered, "I'll kill your wife." Then, just a few feet away, he raped her. He hit again, and again, and again. By the end of 1977, he had attacked over 25 women. Each time, he grew bolder, more daring. He would break into homes just blocks from where police were stationed. He even called victims after the attacks, just to let them know he remembered them. He seemed untouchable, like a ghost, like a shadow that melted into the night and reappeared wherever it pleased. And through it all, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no arrests. But in 1978, the rage changed, it sharpened, and the man who once came only for control was beginning to kill. February 2nd, 1978. The sun dipped low over Sacramento, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood of Cordova Meadows. The streets were still. Children had gone inside. The wind pushed dry leaves across driveways, and porch lights blinked on one by one. Inside a modest home, Brian and Katie Maggiore were preparing for the evening. Brian, 21, was a military policeman at Mather Air Force Base. Katie, just 20, was his high school sweetheart. Newly married, full of plans, full of life, they decided to take a walk that night. It was something they did often, a way to wind down, to breathe in the cool air and escape the stillness of their home. They never came back. What exactly happened on that quiet street is still partly mystery, but the pieces recovered later painted a chilling picture. A man had been watching them. He wasn't expecting the couple. But when they appeared, walking hand in hand through a back pathway behind some houses, he acted. Fast, violent, methodical. A confrontation. Voices raised. A chase. Brian tried to run. Katie, terrified, followed him through a neighbor's yard. But they didn't make it far. Shots rang out in the dark, 4, maybe 5. Neighbors heard them and stepped outside. What they found was a scene out of a nightmare. Brian lay near a fence, shot dead. Katie had tried to escape. She was found a short distance away, collapsed in the dirt. She died on the way to the hospital. Nothing was taken. Nothing stolen. No motive. No leads. Just 2 young lives extinguished in seconds. At first, police treated it as a random act of violence. Maybe a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a domestic dispute that spilled onto the street. But a few things didn't add up. A composite sketch emerged. A slim man in his 20s, wearing a ski mask, possibly seen lurking in the area before the murder. And the more detectives looked, the more one name kept surfacing. The East Area Rapist. It had been months since his last known attack. Now 2 people were dead. Had something changed? Was this planned? Or had they interrupted something darker? Rumors spread. Had the Maggioras stumbled across the East Area Rapist staking out his next victim? Had they simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. The game had changed. This wasn't just a predator anymore. He was a killer. And he was getting more dangerous with every passing day. But instead of slowing down, he only escalated. By the summer of 1978, he was back. New victims, new towns, new terror. He was no longer just stalking Sacramento. Now, he was hunting the rest of California. California was no longer sleeping easy. The man who started as a burglar in Visalia, who evolved into a rapist in Sacramento, who then killed a young couple in cold blood, was on the move. His reign of terror was no longer confined to one neighborhood or one region. He was shifting, adapting, growing more dangerous. Each attack more brazen than the last. And this time, he wasn't just coming for women alone. It began subtly, as it always did. Reports in Contra Costa County, prowlers in the shadows, sliding doors left open, dogs barking at nothing. Then came the attacks. Danville, Fremont, San Jose, Walnut Creek, Pittsburgh, each town just a new pin on the growing map of fear. And his methods evolved. He started targeting couples. He would break in late at night, his face masked, his flashlight blinding. He carried a gun. He knew how to control a room instantly. The man of the house, tied up, forced to lie face down. He'd stack dishes on his back and whisper a threat. If I hear these rattle, I'll kill her. Then he'd drag the woman away. The attacks were no longer just about power. They were about domination. Over families, over relationships, over life itself. And he was careful. No fingerprints, no fibers, no evidence. He came and went like smoke. He often used the couple's own shoelaces to bind them. He would stay in the house for hours, sometimes eating their food, opening drawers, leaving behind a mess that felt more like a message than a mistake. He wanted them to know he had time, that he was in control from the moment he stepped inside to the moment he chose to leave. The media dubbed him with a new name, the Night Stalker, though that name would later belong to another killer entirely. Law enforcement, overwhelmed and increasingly desperate, tried to warn the public. Community meetings were packed, flyers were handed out, helicopters scanned rooftops with searchlights. But it didn't matter. He wasn't afraid. He taunted the police. He taunted the victims. He even made phone calls, whispering threats, breathing heavily, promising to return. He knew the system. He knew how long it took for patrol cars to respond. He knew how to avoid patrol patterns. He knew what it felt like to wear a badge, because once he had. What investigators didn't know yet was that this man wasn't just a career criminal. He had once been one of them. By the time 1980 arrived, there were more than 50 confirmed rapes, dozens of break-ins, and 2 murders on record. But the worst was yet to come. He would soon abandon the rope and the mask for something even more terrifying. Cold-blooded murder, again and again. Southern California. The attacks had stopped in the north. No more phone calls, no more masked break-ins. Sacramento, Contra Costa, and San Jose slowly began to exhale, thinking perhaps the nightmare had ended. But the man they feared hadn't vanished. He had moved. And now, in the quiet coastal towns of Southern California, Ventura, Goleta, Irvine, Dana Point, the darkness returned. Only this time, there were no survivors. It began in the fall of 1979. A couple, Dr. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning, were found murdered inside their condo in Goleta. He had been shot. She had been raped, then killed. The bindings were consistent with earlier attacks, ligatures made from shoelaces and cords torn from blinds. But there was something colder about this scene. The killer hadn't panicked. He had taken his time. He had made sure there would be no second chances. He wasn't just the East Area Rapist anymore. He was something new, something worse. He was evolving into what law enforcement would call the original Night Stalker. In 1980, a new crime shook Ventura to its core. Charlene and Lyman Smith, a well-respected couple, were found bludgeoned to death in their bed. Lyman was a rising attorney. Charlene had been raped before the killer used a log from their firewood pile to beat them both. The brutality was escalating, the sadism deeper. This wasn't just about control anymore. It was about annihilation. Over the next 6 years, the bodies continued to surface. In Irvine, Keith and Patrice Harrington, newlyweds just 3 months into marriage, found dead in their bedroom. In Goleta again, Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, murdered in what seemed to be a botched attack, the killer caught off guard, but still lethal. In Dana Point, Manuela Withun, killed while her husband was in the hospital, no one to protect her. In Irvine, Janelle Cruz, just 18 years old, raped and murdered while home alone. Each crime carried the same quiet precision. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no clear motive. Just horror left behind in neat, familiar loops of ligature and silent, shattered rooms. By now, the state was in a state of panic fatigue. Some residents had forgotten the East Area Rapist. Others thought this new killer was someone entirely different. And law enforcement, they weren't connecting the dots either. Different jurisdictions, different cases. No national database, no DNA link yet. It would take decades before anyone realized that the man who raped 50-plus women in Northern California was the same man murdering couples in the South. He wasn't gone. He was refining his craft. And the deeper he went into the shadows, the harder he became to find. What no one could have imagined was that when the killings finally stopped, the story was far from over, because the man who had terrorized California for over a decade was still watching, still breathing, still waiting. Janelle Cruz was just 18 when her life was stolen. A kind-hearted girl, bright, beautiful. She was home alone in Irvine, her parents away on vacation. He found her, he raped her, he beat her to death. And then, like the night itself, he vanished. It was the last known crime. No more break-ins, no more whispers in the phone, no more masked man standing in the doorway with a flashlight and a knife. After more than a decade of terror, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the man the world would one day call the Golden State Killer. And just like that, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it haunts. Police departments across California still held stacks of unsolved cases, evidence bags aging in storage, crime scene photos yellowing at the edges, rape kits frozen in time. For years, detectives pored over the same files, hoping the missing piece would fall into place. But as months became years and years became decades, hope faded. He had gotten away with it. Some thought he was dead. Others believed he'd been arrested for something else. A few feared the worst, that he was still out there, just waiting. Because how does a man go from such rage, such violence, to nothing? Does a predator like that ever stop? Or does he simply learn how to disappear? Behind the scenes, victims moved on, or tried to. Some changed their names. Some never spoke of what happened again. Some lived in constant fear, double-checking every lock, startled by the phone ringing at night. Their trauma didn't fade. It just buried itself deeper. And still, the silence remained. Years passed. Technology evolved. DNA testing grew more sophisticated. In 2001, the bomb finally dropped. A criminalist reviewing old DNA samples made a discovery. The man who had raped and attacked dozens of women in the North was the same man who murdered at least 10 people in the South. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were one and the same. Now they had a name for him, one that matched the size of the horror he left behind. The Golden State Killer. But knowing he existed didn't mean knowing who he was. His name, his face, his life, still hidden. It would take someone outside the system to find the light switch. someone who became obsessed, someone who gave the victims a voice long after the police had stopped knocking. She wasn't a cop. She didn't wear a badge. She had no forensics lab, no team, no clearance. What she had was obsession. Michelle McNamara was a writer, a wife, a mother, and a lifelong devotee of true crime. While others consumed stories of murder like late-night entertainment, Michelle studied them. She saw them as puzzles. Mysteries worth solving, not for fame, but for truth. And in 2011, she found the story that would consume her life. The story of the Golden State Killer. At the time, most people had never heard of him. He didn't have a Netflix series. There were no podcasts, no viral threads, no Reddit sleuths digging through archives. He was a cold case, fractured across counties, names, and decades. Michelle didn't just want to tell his story. She wanted to find him. She started with her blog, True Crime Diary. She interviewed victims, dug through court transcripts, read police reports until her eyes burned, contacted retired detectives who had long packed away their notebooks in grief. She built timelines, mapped attack sites, connected dots that no one had bothered to connect. And slowly she gave the faceless killer something new, attention, the same kind he had once craved. But Michelle turned the lens away from the man and onto the survivors. She gave them names. She gave them space. She let them tell their stories, not as victims, but as voices. She coined the name Golden State Killer, a name that captured the breadth of his crimes, from Visalia to Ventura, a name that stuck. And she kept digging. When the world stopped watching, Michelle didn't. She stayed awake, night after night, buried in files, obsessed with what she called the Golden State Killer's orbit. She believed he was still alive, living somewhere normal, hidden in plain sight. She even had a mantra. It's going to sound strange, but I feel like I'm going to catch him. But the weight of the darkness takes its toll. Michelle's work was relentless, so was her insomnia. She chased the story deeper and deeper, always trying to bring it to light. On April 21st, 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep. A combination of prescription medications, a heart that had carried too much. She never saw his arrest, never saw his face, never heard the name that matched the DNA. But she left behind her work, her words, her fire. Finished with the help of her husband, Patton Oswalt, and her friends, it sparked a movement, a renewed focus, a promise to finish what she started. Michelle didn't catch the Golden State Killer, but she lit the fuse. And 2 years later, he was caught. April 24th, 2018, Sacramento County. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the neighborhood of Citrus Heights. Middle class, suburban. At 4:30 p.m. everything changed. Law enforcement swarmed a tan, single-story home, unmarked cars, FBI agents, weapons drawn. And from behind the door stepped an old man, pale, thin, 72 years old. He blinked into the sunlight, confused, caught off guard. This was Joseph James DeAngelo, the man who had lived in this house for years, the man who neighbors described as grumpy, private, prone to angry outbursts, a retired mechanic, a grandfather, someone you wouldn't look twice at. But inside that fragile-looking body lived the monster they had been hunting for 44 years. The Golden State Killer had been found. He didn't say a word at first, didn't resist. He looked at the agents as if they were there for someone else. But investigators had something he couldn't escape: DNA. It had started as a long shot. Detectives using discarded DNA from DeAngelo's trash, matched against samples from the old rape and murder scenes. Using a genealogy website, they built a family tree. And at the very top of that tree was a man who once wore a badge, a former police officer. A man who'd worked in Auburn and Exeter in the 1970s. A man who knew police procedure, who'd patrolled neighborhoods during the same years he was terrorizing them. Joseph James DeAngelo had lived a double life. By day, a cop. By night, a sadistic predator who broke into homes, bound his victims, raped them, and later murdered them in cold blood. The news broke like wildfire. Every headline screamed it: Golden State Killer arrested after 4 decades. DNA cracks case that haunted California. Serial killer was living among us all along. Survivors wept. Some screamed. Some simply stood in silence, staring at the photograph of the man they had imagined for so long. He didn't look like a monster. He looked ordinary. And that, in many ways, made it worse. In jail, he faked weakness. He shuffled in court, pretended confusion, stared at the floor as victims stood and called him what he was, a coward. But behind the scenes, guards reported something else. DeAngelo was alert. He exercised at night. He spoke clearly. The frail act, just that, an act. Just another mask. Joseph James DeAngelo had lived a quiet life for decades after his last known murder. He had raised daughters, shopped at local stores, tinkered in his garage, and no one suspected a thing until the truth, sealed in blood, finally surfaced. The arrest was only the beginning. Now came the reckoning. Now came the voices. Now came the justice. Because after a lifetime of silence, the survivors were ready to speak. It was the summer of 2020. The world was in chaos, a global pandemic, uncertainty, fear. But inside a Sacramento courtroom, something quiet and extraordinary was unfolding. The man who had once whispered threats in the dark, the man who tied hands behind backs and took control of entire households, now sat small and still in a wheelchair. Joseph James DeAngelo, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands folded, his eyes vacant. For decades, he had silenced dozens of voices through fear, trauma, and death. But now, the silence was broken. Over 6 days, the courtroom filled with faces from the past. Survivors, family members of the murdered, women and men who had lived in the long, dark shadow he cast over California. They had waited 30, 40, even 45 years for this moment. One by one they stood. Some cried, some screamed, some simply stared him down with a strength that didn't need words. Each voice was a brick in the wall of justice being built around him. Each one took something back he had tried to steal. Their power, their story, their name. And still, DeAngelo sat motionless. No apology, no explanation, just the twitch of a jaw, the occasional glance to the floor. But he couldn't run, he couldn't hide, because this time he was trapped, and they were free. In total, 26 survivors and family members spoke in court. They told their stories, not to relive them, but to reclaim them. What was once a trail of disconnected crimes, scattered across decades, now came together in one place, with one face to blame. And that face sat alone in a box of bulletproof glass. When it was over, the judge asked DeAngelo if he had anything to say. He stood, slowly, his body trembling, leaned into the microphone, and whispered, "I've listened to all your statements, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough." But it was the first time he had acknowledged what he'd done. Too late, too hollow. But there, in public record, the survivors didn't need his apology, because they had already won. They had survived the darkest kind of evil, and now they had spoken and been heard by the world, by the courts, and by him. August 21st, 2020, Sacramento Superior Court. The air inside the courtroom felt different that day, heavier, as if the building itself understood the weight of the moment. The man who had terrorized California for over a decade sat silently beneath flickering fluorescent lights, shackled and still. A mask covered his face, not to hide his identity, but because of a pandemic. And yet, everyone knew exactly who he was. Joseph James DeAngelo. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer. He had gone by many names. Now he would go by one more. Inmate. In a courtroom with no jury, because he had accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, the judge began to speak. His voice was calm, measured. but behind each word was the weight of justice long delayed. Mr. DeAngelo, you will spend the rest of your life in prison, without the possibility of parole, consecutively, for each life you destroyed. The charges were staggering: 13 counts of first-degree murder, 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery, dozens more attacks, rapes, and burglaries folded into the agreement. Each victim, each life, each family, honored by the law, even if too late. The sentence was clear: life in prison, without parole, forever. No appeals, no freedom, no escape. For the first time, the man who once slipped through cracks and shadows now had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He would die in a cage. There was no outburst, no drama, no emotion. DeAngelo sat as he always had, quiet, detached, small. But to the people watching, the survivors, the families, the detectives who had spent decades chasing a ghost, it didn't matter. He was done. And they could finally move forward. After the hearing ended, the judge said something rare, something human. This is the most horrific case I've ever seen. And I want to thank the survivors. Your courage is what brought this case to justice. There were no cheers, no applause, only silence. The kind that comes after a storm finally breaks. Outside, the survivors gathered, not as victims, but as a community. Some smiled, some hugged, some cried, and some just stood there staring at the sky, feeling the weight of it all lift, slowly, quietly. Justice had come, not fast, not easy, but it had come. When the name Joseph James DeAngelo first hit headlines in 2018, most people didn't recognize it. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a drifter or a lunatic scribbling manifestos. He didn't live on the margins of society. He lived next door, a retired mechanic, a former Navy veteran, a father, a grandfather, and once, a cop. It wasn't the face people had imagined when they thought of the Golden State Killer. But maybe that was the point. Joseph was born in 1945, just after World War II, in Bath, New York. His early life was marked by whispers of violence. Family members would later claim he was abused, physically, emotionally. There were stories of him witnessing a sibling being sexually assaulted at a young age, of him torturing animals, of simmering rage behind blank expressions. After high school, he joined the Navy and served in Vietnam, a quiet soldier, disciplined, unnoticed. When he returned home, he earned a degree in criminal justice. Then, irony of ironies, he became a police officer. He worked in Exeter from 1973 to 1976, then in Auburn until 1979. That timeline is no coincidence, because while he wore a badge by day, he was breaking into homes by night. When the Visalia Ransacker vanished in 1976, it was the same year DeAngelo moved north and joined a new police department. When he was finally fired in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, the rapes escalated into murders. He didn't stop because of morality. He adjusted because he had lost the protection of the badge. The mask slipped, and he evolved again. For years, Joseph blended in. He married, had 3 daughters, coached youth sports, worked as a truck mechanic at a Save Mart grocery chain. He lived in the same house in Citrus Heights for decades, a quiet man, gruff, angry, but forgettable. Neighbors said he yelled at people from his driveway. Others noticed he never talked much, but no one ever guessed the truth. Behind the garage door was a world of secrets. He kept souvenirs, weapons, carefully preserved trophies from the lives he destroyed. And when the attack stopped in 1986, he simply faded into suburbia. The most chilling part? He watched the world search for him. He followed the headlines, he read the forums, he even read Michelle McNamara's blog. He knew she was getting close. He knew the pressure was building. But he believed, right up until the day agents knocked on his door, that he would never be caught. When asked why he stopped killing, one theory emerged. He had gotten older. He had a family. He no longer had the stamina to stalk, break in, dominate. But the urges, they never left. In secretly recorded jailhouse audio, Joseph whispered to himself, "I did all that. I didn't want to do it, but I did. I pushed Jerry out. I had to do it. He made me." Jerry, the name he gave his dark half. It was the closest thing to a confession he ever gave, and maybe the only glimpse of what was truly inside him. Joseph James DeAngelo wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, and the mask he wore for 40 years was normalcy. The crimes are over, the killer is in prison, but the echoes remain, not just in the courtrooms or the headlines, but in the homes, the hearts, and the history of California. Because what Joseph DeAngelo stole wasn't just lives. He stole safety. He stole trust. He altered the way an entire generation lived their lives. In the 1970s and 80s, people started sleeping with guns under their pillows. They bought floodlights, locked every window, and installed bolts on doors that had never needed them before. In Sacramento, parents no longer let their kids bike freely after dark. In Ventura, women refused to sleep alone. In Contra Costa County, men stayed awake deep into the night, patrolling their homes, hoping they wouldn't hear that quiet creak of a window sliding open. Fear became a ritual, an everyday weight, passed down from one decade to the next. Even after the crimes stopped, the wounds didn't. Many victims never spoke publicly. They carried their pain into marriages, into motherhood, into old age. Some were never believed. Some were blamed. Some buried the truth so deeply they forgot how to live without it pressing on their chest. And yet, they endured. For the families of the murdered, the legacy was more than fear. It was absence. Empty chairs at weddings, unwritten birthdays, decades spent staring at photographs and wondering why. Why them? Why that night? Why did he get to live a quiet life while they lived inside a memory that never healed? And for the detectives, it was obsession. Many never stopped chasing him. Years after retirement, they stayed up late, reviewing files in basements and spare rooms, haunted by the feeling that they should have stopped him sooner. One cop even kept a map of DeAngelo's crimes on his garage wall until the day he died. They didn't call him by name, they didn't know it yet, but they felt him, they knew him, and they carried him like a weight, until justice finally lifted it. But perhaps the greatest legacy of all isn't fear, it's resilience. Because for every life DeAngelo tried to ruin, dozens fought back. Some spoke out, some stayed silent, but they all survived. And in 2020, when they stood in court and looked him in the eye, they weren't scared anymore. They were angry. They were powerful. They were free. The Golden State Killer left behind a fractured trail, dozens of victims, hundreds of crimes. But in the end, his story is not about what he did. It's about those who stood up decades later and said, "You don't get to own this anymore." Joseph James DeAngelo is now locked away, sentenced to die behind bars. But the questions still linger. How did he escape justice for so long? Who else knew? And in the end, was the trail of DNA that brought him down as clear-cut as it seemed? The truth may never be black and white, but one thing is certain: the fear he created was real. The voices of the survivors were powerful. And after 44 years in the shadows, the Golden State Killer was finally unmasked. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've survived for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell, because in the world of horror, you never know what's lurking next. Got a creepy story, a twisted theory, or a horror film you think we should unearth? Drop it in the comments. I'll be watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and whatever you do, don't look behind you.